Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Anglo-Egyptian War and the struggle for Egypt's future. Here is the scene. Late 19th century Egypt is not a quiet corner on the map. It is the hallway outside the world's busiest meeting room. Look at a globe and trace the scene where Europe, Africa, and Asia touch. That hinges Egypt. Caravans, steamers, diplomats, and dreamers all pass through this narrow corridor. When a place sits at a crossroads, it does not simply host travelers, it becomes the stage on which empires perform. Now, consider the Suez Canal, opened in 1869. Before Suez, British ships bound for India had to sail the long arc around the Cape of Good Hope. After Suez, the route snaps into a straight line, time collapses, and London feels much closer to Bombay and Shanghai. Imagine you are running a global business in the age of coal and telegraph. A shortcut like this is not a luxury, it is a lifeline. Whoever guarantees that canal's safety and predictability holds the wristwatch of the British Empire. That alone would make Egypt important. Combined with its location, it makes Egypt indispensable. But geography gives, and geography demands. To look modern and powerful, Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail Inouye Pasha, launched an ambitious campaign to remake the country. Railways and schools, irrigation and grand boulevards, opera houses and courtly ceremonies, all the visual language of a state stepping onto the world stage. Ambition, however, requires cash. Egypt borrowed heavily from European financiers, confident that growth would outrun the interest. At first the numbers looked impressive, then the bills came due. Anyone who has ever taken on a loan can feel the logic here. You borrow for a project that promises tomorrow's prosperity, yet the interest arrives today, every month, without fail. As the debt piled up, the balance of power shifted in a very quiet way. When outside creditors begin to worry, they rarely send soldiers first. They send accountants, advisors, and conditions. They offer stability, but always at a price. In Egypt's case, European officials gained seats near the levers of taxation and expenditure. Their language was prudent management and fiscal responsibility. Their presence meant that Egyptian priorities now had to pass through foreign ledgers. So this is our starting point. A country that is the keyhole to global trade. A canal that compresses the planet and magnifies British interests. A modernization drive funded by loans that seemed manageable until they were not. And a growing foreign role in governance, justified as financial stewardship. Here is the question that will echo through our story. When a nation's most strategic asset is also its most expensive obligation, who is really in charge? The map suggests one answer, the balance sheet suggests another. Keep that tension in mind as we move forward. By 1876, Egypt's balancing act had collapsed. The country was bankrupt, not just low on funds, but officially unable to pay what it owed. And when that happens to a strategic country in the late 19th century, it is like blood in the water for imperial powers. Britain and France moved quickly to impose what they politely called visual control. In plain language, they took over Egypt's finances. Imagine a board of trustees for your country's treasury where the majority of the seats suddenly belong to foreigners. Every major spending decision, every tax policy, every budget revision now passes under their stamp. At first, the change might have looked administrative, even harmless to the average Egyptian. But beneath the surface, resentment began to simmer. It was not just about numbers on a ledger. It was about dignity. Egyptian army officers, many of whom had fought and bled for their homeland, saw foreign oversight as an insult. Urban elites who prided themselves on Egypt's modernization now watched decisions about their own country made in offices that spoke French and English more often than Arabic. Out of this frustration stepped a figure who would become the face of Egyptian nationalism, Colonel Ahmed Urabi. He was not born into the upper aristocracy. He came from a modest rural background, which made his rise in the army all the more remarkable. Urabi was a soldier, but also a speaker who could stir a crowd. He channeled the anger of officers denied promotions, the discontent of urban professionals sidelined by foreign appointees, and the pride of citizens who believed Egypt should be run by Egyptians. His demands were not abstract, they were reforms aimed at restoring sovereignty and limiting foreign dominance. As the years rolled toward the early 1880s, tensions only escalated. The Khedive, eager to hold onto his throne, leaned on British and French support. The nationalist movement, led by Urabi, gained momentum and refused to back down. And foreign powers, sensing that instability threatened their investments and, most importantly, the Suez Canal, began to think not in terms of advice and oversight, but of direct action. It was a collision course. Each faction saw itself as defending Egypt's future. The question was, whose vision of that future would prevail? Now, with this powder keg set, the only thing missing was the spark. And that spark would come in the coastal city of Alexandria. In June of 1882, the city of Alexandria erupted. What began as street-level unrest quickly escalated into full-blown riots. The targets were often Europeans, symbols of the foreign presence in Egypt, and the violence left a number of Europeans dead. In an already tense climate, this was more than a local disturbance, it was exactly the kind of event foreign powers feared, and perhaps, in some corners, anticipated. Because in the logic of empire, unrest can become the perfect justification for intervention. Britain seized the moment. The riots became their pretext for military involvement. Their argument was framed in the language of protection of foreign nationals, protection of trade, protection of the Suez Canal. France, interestingly, hesitated. While they had been part of the dual control system, they were less eager to commit troops to Egypt's streets, leaving Britain in the driver's seat. Then came the turning point, the decision to use overwhelming force. On July 11, 1882, the Royal Navy under Admiral Seymour opened fire on Alexandria from the sea. It was not a surgical strike. Naval bombardment in the 19th century was more about shock and awe than precision. The city's defenses were hit, but so were neighborhoods and civilians. The casualty numbers were significant, and the destruction was visible from miles away. Imagine the skyline of your city shrouded in smoke, familiar streets reduced to rubble, and the air thick with the sound of shells landing one after another. The aftermath was as much psychological as physical. Alexandria, one of Egypt's key ports, lay battered. For many Egyptians, the bombardment confirmed what they already suspected, that foreign powers would not hesitate to use brute force to maintain their grip. Anti-British sentiment deepened, and for Britain, the bombardment cleared the way for the next phase, moving forces inland to decisively crush nationalist resistance. The war was no longer a distant possibility. It was now fully underway, and all roads, or in this case, canals and rail lines, led toward a decisive confrontation. After the bombardment of Alexandria, Britain wasted no time turning its military gaze inland. The man in charge was Sir Garnet Wolseley, a seasoned commander with a reputation for swift and decisive campaigns. His plan was clear: use the Suez Canal as a highway for troops, supplies, and equipment, and push directly toward the heart of Ahmed Urabi's defensive lines. The canal, originally built for commerce, was now serving as a conveyor belt for war. Urabi understood the stakes. If the British could move unopposed through the Suez and strike deep into the country, nationalist resistance might collapse before it had a chance to fully mobilize. So he chose Tel el-Keba, a position he believed could be fortified into a formidable barrier. Over the following days, Egyptian forces dug in. Trenches were cut into the dry earth. Artillery was positioned, and lines of defense were mapped out. Urabi anticipated a prolonged engagement, one that might grind down the British advance and force a political settlement. But Wolseley had no intention of giving him that kind of fight. On September 13, 1882, before the first light of dawn, British troops launched a surprise assault. Moving under the cover of darkness, they closed the distance quickly. By the time the Egyptian defenders realized the scale of the attack, the British were already upon them. In less than an hour, the battle was over. The speed of the assault was as devastating as the firepower. Egyptian lines broke, and what had been intended as a defensive stronghold became the site of a rapid collapse. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. Urabi was captured soon after and, rather than face execution, was exiled. His removal decapitated the nationalist movement's leadership, leaving the resistance scattered and disorganized. For Britain, the victory at Tel el-Keba was more than just a battlefield success. It was the key that unlocked control over Egypt itself. With the military resistance broken, the next step was political, shaping Egypt's governance in a way that served imperial priorities while keeping up the appearance of local rule. That step would be known as the Veiled Protectorate. With Urabi out of the picture and his forces dismantled, Britain moved to cement its hold over Egypt, but not in the blunt, colonial style of planting a flag and declaring direct rule. Instead, they crafted something far more subtle and, in many ways, more effective: the so-called Veiled Protectorate. Here's how it worked. The Khedive, still technically Egypt's ruler, was restored to his throne. To the outside world, especially to the Ottoman Empire, which still claimed nominal sovereignty over Egypt, this arrangement preserved the image of Egyptian self-governance. But the reality was very different. Behind the scenes, British officials held decisive influence over every major decision. The most important ministries, especially those dealing with finance, infrastructure, and defense, operated under the guidance, or more accurately, the direction, of British advisors. The Suez Canal remained the jewel in this arrangement. Britain's presence guaranteed that no rival power could threaten the artery connecting Britain to its empire in India and beyond. In this sense, Egypt's stability was never just about Egypt, it was about safeguarding the very structure of British global trade and power. Every soldier stationed in Cairo, every administrative directive from London, was ultimately about that thin ribbon of water cutting through the desert. And so the occupation stretched on. Officially, Britain always hinted that it was temporary, that it would end once Egypt was stable and capable of self-rule. But stability, in imperial vocabulary, often meant a stability favorable to the occupier's interests. In practice, the British military presence would last for decades, shaping Egypt's politics, economy, and foreign relations long after the cannons of Tel el-Keba fell silent. This was control without the formalities of conquest, a system that allowed Britain to reap the benefits of empire without some of its political costs. It was called veiled for a reason. The outward symbols of sovereignty remained Egyptian, but the real power was exercised elsewhere. The aftermath of British control brought a mixed legacy, one part stability, one part dependency, and a long shadow of resentment. On the surface, the fiscal situation improved. The same foreign oversight that had once sparked nationalist anger now ensured Egypt's debts were serviced on time, that revenues were collected efficiently, and that large-scale public projects could proceed without the same reckless borrowing that had sunk the Khedive regime. If you were a British investor, Egypt suddenly looked like a safer bet. But stability bought through foreign control is never free. While the numbers in the ledgers might have balanced, the cost was a loss of genuine political sovereignty. Egyptians still saw a flag that was theirs, a ruler with an Egyptian title, and ministries staffed in part by their own people, yet they knew the real authority sat with British advisors, backed by troops who were not going anywhere. This tension fueled a steady undercurrent of nationalist sentiment. It didn't vanish after Urabi's exile. In fact, it deepened. Intellectuals, students, army officers, and merchants all carried the awareness that Egypt's future was being decided in a conversation in which they were, at best, occasional guests. And every time Britain acted with the canal in mind rather than the people in mind, the resentment grew. Geopolitically, Egypt's position in the Middle East only became more strategic as the years passed. The canal was not just a British concern, it became a global asset, a point of leverage in diplomacy, and a target in every great power's contingency plans. This meant that Egypt's internal politics were almost always tied to external pressures, from London, Paris, Istanbul, and later, far beyond. Perhaps most telling was the pattern this occupation revealed, a pattern that would repeat elsewhere in the world. A nation burdened by debt, strategically located, and rich in resources or trade routes becomes a magnet for foreign assistance. That assistance stabilizes the books, but it often rewrites the story of the country's independence. Egypt in the late 19th century was not the first to experience this, and it would certainly not be the last. What can we learn from the Anglo-Egyptian War and its aftermath? At first glance, it might seem like just another 19th century imperial episode, Britain safeguarding a trade route, toppling resistance, and leaving behind a system of indirect rule. But look closer, and the themes are far bigger and far older. First, the link between debt and sovereignty is undeniable. Egypt's road to foreign control did not begin with soldiers, it began with loans. Ambitious modernization projects, funded by foreign credit, opened the door to outside influence long before the first British warship appeared on the horizon. History shows that when creditors decide your priorities, they often decide your politics too. Second, stability and dependency can grow together in the same soil. Britain did stabilize Egypt's finances and protect the Suez Canal from rival powers. But that stability was not for Egypt's sake alone, it was for the empire's lifeline to India and beyond. For Egyptians, stability meant the trains ran on time, but they ran according to someone else's timetable. Third, strategic assets like the Suez Canal are both a blessing and a burden. They attract commerce, wealth, and international attention, but they also invite competition, interference, and in Egypt's case, decades of occupation. Owning a piece of the world's most important trade route made Egypt powerful on paper, but vulnerable in practice. Finally, there's the question of alternatives. Could Egypt have charted a different path, one that balanced modernization with sovereignty, one that welcomed foreign investment without surrendering control? Or is that balance so delicate that it's almost impossible to maintain when great powers are involved? These are not just questions for the 19th century, they're questions for any nation today facing the pull between outside help and self-determination. If you've enjoyed exploring this chapter of history, there's so much more to uncover. Like, comment, and subscribe to join me for more journeys into the past that challenge the way we think about power, economics, and the choices nations make. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description. For those who enjoy thoughtful and entertaining history, there's a whole library waiting for you. Until next time, this has been Truth Behind History.